We are expecting, but I didn't hear anything otherwise.
Okay, great. All right, well, I'll call the meeting to order then of the PFA Mitigation Committee. Andy, will you please call the roll of all members, including ex officio, as well as identifying anybody from ODF&W who's here today?
Yes, give me just a quick second here to pull that list up. Apologies, I'd like a million different things going here. All right, we will start at the top of the list. Please just acknowledge you're present. Chad Washington.
Here.
Bob Van Dyke.
Here.
Kristen Rivard. Getting some feedback. There we go. Thank you for muting. No response from Kristen. Heath Curtis.
Here.
Fran Cafferata.
Here.
Andrew Perky.
Here.
Oh, Andrew joined. Great. Mark Stern.
Here. I'm having trouble getting my video working, but I'm here.
Great. Thank you. Mark Grandbammer.
Present.
Jennifer Wycombe.
Here.
Kate Wells.
Here.
Sarah Gregory. Sarah Gregory, are you present?
I saw an out of office notification from her, Andy. I don't think she's here.
Yes, she is, and that's reminding me she had something come up too. All right, so as of now, just Kristen and Sarah aren't here, so we do have a quorum to move forward. Also present is Sarah Wright from ODFW, and I'm looking at the rest of the list here. Sarah, if you have access to that before I get to it, that'd be great. But
I don't. Did we hear from Chris Allen? I may have missed that.
I'm here.
Hi, Chris.
Thanks, Sarah.
thank you. Sorry about that, Chris.
No worries.
All right. We do have a quorum, Bob, to move forward.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Andy. Welcome, everybody. The next thing we have is the approval of the agenda. Can you put up that slide, please, Andy? I'm seeing the closing comment slide.
Yep. Apologies. Let me loop back here.
No worries. Thank you. Yeah, so the first item is the approval of the agenda, and I would ask for an emotion and a second. I would like to note, as it says up there, we're going to change the OAR item, administrative rule item, to discussion again, only looking to approval at the June meeting. And we can talk more about that when we get to that item. So that's one modification of the agenda. But having said that, can I get a motion and a second for the approval of the agenda?
This is Mark. I move to approve the agenda.
Is there a second? Thank you. That's Heath seconding. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, the agenda is approved. Next is the consent agenda. The one item we have there is the meeting minutes. Is there any discussion of the meeting minutes? Comments there? Okay, any objections to the meeting minutes being approved as part of the consent agenda? Are there any objections? Okay, hearing none, the consent agenda is approved. Let's go now to public comment. Andy, did we get any requests for public comment?
We did get requests at public comment. Let me pull up my participant screen right now. So for those who requested some public comment, now's the opportunity. If you could please raise your hand in the chat and we can unmute you there. I think we got someone unmuting. Holly, did you want to?
Is there anyone there for the comment? Holly Purpura, I think I see there. Pardon me if I butchered the pronunciation. Holly, did you want to give comment? We're not hearing you, or at least I'm not, if you're trying to speak.
All right. I guess not from Holly. We'll give another request for any public comment. Now's the time. Please either raise the hand or unmute. We were going to have a public comment from Coalition of Land Trust, but it does not look like they made it. Although we do have some comments addressed later in the PowerPoint regardless for discussion later.
We did, yes, we did receive comments, and I think I shared those with the entire MAC.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Well, we'll move on from public comment. Apologies to anybody. If you were trying to comment or had any problems there, I hope you feel free to, I hope you contact Andy and let him know. We want to correct that. And there certainly is an opportunity to submit comment in writing. So we are trying to make sure our public comment works. It's a little tricky sometimes with the digital interface here. So apologies to anybody who was not able to, and we could return to you at the end if you do still have and are still trying to get in, and we were unable to have you. All right, well, let's go to the next item, the MAC operating procedures. So these have been before us a couple times. We thought we might approve them last time, but we needed to just change a little bit of the language. Since we adopted the language of urgent grants, we needed to bring that new language over into the operating procedure. So there was a small amendment there. So for this agenda item, we'd like to approve these operating procedures. Of course, the operating procedures aren't in rule, and they could be modified at any meeting if they needed to be modified in the future. But there certainly are a basic document to guide us. Is there any discussion of the operating procedures? Suggested changes that additions folks would try to make? And please use your raise hand function. Okay, well, seeing none, I would ask for a motion then to approve the operating procedures. And here is the form of a motion to keep it official. Andy has helpfully put together on this slide. So if someone would like to make a motion, I hope you will, and we'll need a second.
As Heath Curtis, and I move to adopt the Private Forest Accord Mitigation Advisory Committee operating procedures.
Thank you, Heath. Is there a second?
Yeah, Chad Washington, second the motion.
Great, thank you. Chad, any further discussion of the operating procedures? Okay, just for members of the public, I'll note these have been before us several times before. Even though we're on the cusp of voting for them, you can still send in comments later. As I noted, these could be changed. So if folks have concerns or questions, the committee is certainly happy to entertain those. So seeing no further discussion, we'll hear Mark. Mark's got a comment. Mark Stern, please.
Yeah, I just wondered if you could clarify from a process standpoint, once we approve these, then do they go to the department and the commission, or is this just a internal process that we approve, or maybe some insight there?
Yeah, thank you, Mark. My understanding, and I welcome additions here, is that this is a committee only document. So we control this document as our operating procedures. I imagine that it will be included potentially as part of the OAR package when Andy presents that to the commission to let them know what we're up to. But I welcome other comments there. Andy or Sarah, any thoughts on whether this needs to go elsewhere?
Yeah. That's correct, Bob. You got it right. You got it correct.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Anything else from Mark or others?
I have it's maybe out of order, and Chair, you can manage this as you see fit, but I see Kelly Beamer just was able to join the meeting. She had some trouble joining the meeting, and I think our public comment was from 12:10 thereafter, and so you might consider if, when, or how to allow her the opportunity to speak.
Yeah, certainly. I'm happy to do that, and let's just hope it's not on the operating procedures, which we are in the cusp of voting on. So, but we can happily let her in maybe after this item's finished, unless there are objections there. Okay, any other discussion, comments, or questions on the operating procedures? All right, Andy, can you please call the roll of the voting members?
Alrighty, I will go through the voting members. Please acknowledge as Chad Washington.
How do you want to do this, Andy? Do you want?
Yeah,
I-
I was gonna say we probably want to go aye, and then we'll just do a sweeping vote after, right, Bob? All of any opposed, and go from there.
Yeah, just go through the roll and we'll count the 8 yays and nays, and
Okay.
that will be the result of the vote. So if we need 4 yays, which is the quorum for this, which would be the majority here to pass, given that we have 6 of the members present.
Okay, so please replies yay or nay. Chad Washington,
Yay.
Bob Van Dyke,
Yay.
Kristen Rivard, she is not present. Heath Curtis,
Yes.
Fran Caparata,
Yay.
Andrew Perky,
Yay.
Mark Stern.
Yay.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Well, we now have an official set of operating procedures. Thank you all for your work on those and your patience getting this put together. And thanks, as for most of this, to Andy, especially for his diligence in following up on that document and keeping it moving. I suggest, without objection, we now turn to Kelly Beamer and the public comment that she'd like to provide. Are you out there, Kelly?
I'm out there. Can you hear me?
We can. Thank you. Thank you, Kelly, for joining us. Please identify yourself and any organizational affiliation for the record, and we're then happy to hear from you. And generally, I'll just say our rules call to try to limit to about 3 minutes if you can. Thank you.
Gotcha. Thank you. For the record, my name is Kelly Beamer. I'm the Executive Director for the Coalition of Oregon Land Trusts. We represent 32 entities across the state of Oregon that work on the non-regulatory side using voluntary conservation tools, market-based approaches to protect habitat for fish and wildlife, working farms, forests, water quality. So thank you for the opportunity to provide comments. I submitted some written comments to Andy and Bob, and I believe those have been forwarded on to the full committee. But I first and foremost, I know this takes a lot of work and you're going 1,000 miles a minute. And I want to say thank you for building out a grant program that is simple, flexible, and really is trusting the operations of entities like watershed councils and land trusts who will be implementing the grant program. It was very refreshing to see a program built out in the direction you're going. So thank you for that. Second, I just want to emphasize the opportunity of this program to really maximize co-benefits. For example, our members are working across the Oregon coast and a lot of forest land on drinking water protection, and where there's opportunities where this new mitigation grant program can maximize and leverage investments in drinking water protection, recreation, carbon, road infrastructure. It's a significant investment and source of funding that's coming online, and we're really excited to see how it can help be a leverage point as well, beyond the target of the Habitat Conservation Plan species. So just want to put a plug in for that co-benefit component. And lastly, our members reviewed the draft rules, and our major concern was just some lack of clarity, I think, between what was intended by the committee and the legislation for the grants to be eligible across all lands. So I think the original language said something like supporting the establishment of conservation easements on land other than forest land. We just wanted to make clear that, in fact, the intent was that all lands would be eligible so long as they provide uplift to the key species in the HCP. And also just to clarify that both easements, conservation easements, which remove the development rights, but also acquisitions would be eligible uses of the grant program. So I wanted to make sure to convey that. And again, just convey my thanks to this talented committee that's moving this forward. We're here as partners and look forward to getting to the implementation.
Thank you, Kelly. We look forward to that implementation as well. I'm certain. I really appreciate your group's engagement in this. You're going to be a critical partner going forward. So we're eager to hear further comments in the future and your thoughts on the implementation of the program. So thanks for making the time to join us today. Okay, anybody else out there on public comment? It sounds like we may have had some bumps on getting on board. Andy, are you seeing anybody else who would like to participate? We are slightly ahead of schedule.
Not as it stands now. Let me just double check the chat. Nope. Please raise your hand, put something in the chat. I'm not seeing anything right now, Bob, so I think we're good.
Fantastic. Great. Thanks, Andy. Let's go on to the next item, which is the MAC operating procedures. Pardon me. The MAC administrative rules. Sorry, everybody. The PFA mitigation fund Oregon administration rules. These are the OARs that we've already seen drafts of. We thought we might approve today, but there are some amendments still coming in. I'll let Andy and Sarah speak to the desirability maybe of slowing it down just a little bit and whether that will affect our overall timing. How would you like, do you have thoughts about how to organize this part? Andy, would you like to talk about the timing part to start? We also have the amendments that that came from public comments, and then obviously we want time for discussion by the committee as a whole.
Yeah, thanks, Bob, for teeing that up. So the next few slides here are going to go over some of the comments that we've received from the public. Later in the meeting, we do have an updated timeline, just so everyone does know, for summer that we'll be talking about, which will also involve these rules. But as Bob was saying, next steps is to submit these rules on June 5th, Secretary of State. We've already submitted drafts to economists and draft filings as of last week. As long as we don't make substantial edits, we're able to move forward with the June 5th submission. So the idea is that we review the public comments today with the group, go through them. There's 3 slides worth that we'll review. We will then work with DOJ in the coming week to finalize some edits. I hope to also work with the OAR working group once more after I get a clean version of everything. And then we will move forward with a June 5th submission to Secretary of State. We will then 2 weeks later have our standing committee meeting where we will vote as a committee to adopt the rules, at which point we do not need to submit any adoptions or whatever to the Secretary of State. But as Bob said before, I can include that stuff in the packet when I present to Commission later this year in August. So that's more formally adopted. But that's kind of the timeline we're outlining here today. So that's why we're not voting to adopt at this point in time. We have a lot of edits that have come in, and we want to make sure we give ample time to all of it. But that being said, we still believe we'll be on time for the August rule adoption nonetheless, and with the rest of the timeline, which we'll discuss later. Sarah, is there anything I missed that you might want to add on that?
No, Andy, I think you covered it really well. I'm here in case there's any follow-up questions to Andy's explanation.
All right, well, I was just
go.
Oh, go ahead, sorry, Bob.
Pardon me, I would just offer one small point. In the end, of course, the MAC doesn't approve the rules. All we're doing is we will, and partly I think Chad agrees with this too, we'll recommend them. We'll tell the commission that we approve of the rules that have gone forward. So your next meeting will be a chance for us to formally weigh in on these. My understanding is there'll still be a little bit of wiggle room. Hopefully between now and June 5th, we can get done anything substantive, but then, and we should see that certainly for the mid-June meeting, but there will be a little bit of time there as part of the general public comment period as well to make some small suggestions going forward. So. Okay,
yeah, correct.
thanks.
It will go through the formal pipeline for comments and everything else as we move forward through the process. And just to paint the picture for the committee, the edits that we've seen thus far from our community has not been substantial, but they are important as we just had public comment. But I will, at this point, I guess I'll just move forward. Does that work for you, Bob and Sarah? We'll start with the first one. All right, perfect. I think, Mark, we got your edit here first. So we have 3 slides here. So what I'm providing is just for reference for you guys. If you're following on your own document, you have the OAR number, you have the page number there. We have the existing language and the requested change. So this was requested by Mark Stern. Mark, I didn't know if you wanted to speak. Since you're here, I don't need to speak on your behalf, or I can just go ahead with this.
Oh, I'm glad to share. I think I was just trying to clarify that the original intent seemed to be talking about wildfire resiliency and those issues to protect streams from excess sediment. And I guess I just wanted to clarify, when there is a wildfire, a lot of the sediment comes from the uplands and the entire watershed. So I thought it'd be helpful just to clarify that we're talking about healthy watersheds with the riparian corridor, wet meadow complexes, and the forested uplands as from an ecological or reality standpoint of how wildfire works, to clarify that.
Any discussion? Yeah, any discussion here of this? I guess for my part, I'll say this makes sense to me. Chad, please.
Just echo the same thing, Bob. I think this makes sense, and it allows for some fuel mitigation work upslope that will directly reduce wildfire intensity and hopefully thus reduce sediment delivery post-fire. So I like the clarification, and it helps broaden the scope.
Thanks, Chad. Any other comments? And we certainly welcome participation from the ex officio members. I'd like to remind everybody out there too. Okay, well, seeing no comments, unless there's objection, I'll ask that this be included in the updated rule language. Are there any objections or further discussion there? Okay, well, without objection, we'll move on to the next comment then.
All right, this was a comment by the Oregon Coalition of Land Trusts. Echoing what was just spoken in the public comment period. So now is an opportunity if we wanted to further discussion on it. But the existing language, for those who are listening on the phone, is supporting establishment of conservation easements on land other than forest land to protect, enhance, and restore riparian areas. And the requested change is supporting acquisition of land and interests in land, including conservation easements to protect, enhance, and restore riparian areas or other critical habitat functions for ACP species, to essentially broaden, I guess, the definition there. Pass it over to you there, Bob.
My understanding of this is, if you look at the initial language, there's 2 things. It only mentions conservation easements, and it says those easements have to be on land other than forest land. And my impression from the PFA is that we wanted to support a broader variety of potential interests, not only conservation easements. In fact, there may be acquisitions that are helpful. And furthermore, that including those on forest land as an option is desirable as well. So those are the 2 elements I see. It's broadening the type of instrument, including acquisitions, as well as where they can be established, not only off forest land, but on any land ownership. Heath Curtis, I see you've got a hand up.
Yeah, Bob, I have no idea why that would have been drafted in that manner in the beginning. I would say that, it needn't appear here, but in full transparency to anybody on the call and the rest of the members, I'm interested in ensuring that working forest lands remain working forest lands, and that these monies are not used to put working forests to sleep. And I think that can be pursued in the grant criteria and other places other than the rules, but I just wanted to be plain that I think that conservation easements and land acquisitions make some sense, provided this program is not used to handicap the timber industry.
Thank you, Heath. I see Jennifer and then Andrew with hands up. Jennifer?
Yeah, I have a question. I'm kind of getting into the weeds here, and it's not really about the suggested change, but I was wondering if there's a specific reason why we're using HCP species here, and just a clause or 2 above it, we use HCP covered species.
It would be, I would change it to covered just to follow up on that one. That's my oversight.
Okay.
there. Because the rest of the document does say HCP covered species.
Okay, I didn't know if there was some reason, so I just wanted to ask the question. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. And whatever it is, we want some consistency there. I
Yep.
think, covered species and covered lands is another term. We just want those terms of art to be consistent across.
Thank you.
Andrew, please.
Yeah, Heath, could I just confirm my understanding of what you said there? I want to make sure I got it right, which is that you're open to targeted land acquisition and or easements to achieve objectives, but you just don't want to see that obviously be done in a way that is detrimental to production on forest land.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
But you're not opposed to using the fund to purchase fee interest in a parcel if.
No, and in many conservation easements, in fact, are explicit about retaining the working forest attributes of the lands acquired. That is to say, the covenants and restrictions in the easement target things like housing development and other ways in which it may impact the working forest. And again, I'm only one member of this committee, but I just wanted to be transparent and open with everybody about my priorities in advancing conservation easements and land acquisitions are to do that in a manner that doesn't otherwise, handicap the working forest attributes.
Thanks, Heath. I bring it up because what Kelly Beamer said about members of the Coalition of Land Trusts, some of them being on the coast and focused in on drinking water quality and quantity on coastal communities. And then I was in Seaside last week for Oregon Water Resources Department's public meeting around their integrated water resource strategy. And the mayor of the city of Seaside really honed in on their desire to acquire land on the edges of their watershed, that is their drinking watershed, to be able to protect both quality and quantity. And implicit in that statement that he made was that you'd be acquiring timberland, presumably, right, in the Coast Range. So I just want to make sure we're clear that maybe in targeted instances, it would be appropriate for the habitat values and then the secondary or the co-benefits, as Kelly said, for communities and their drinking water supply to acquire timberland to protect it. That's different than obviously, Heath, the example you gave of kind of a working lands easement in which there would be some harvest occurring. It just feels like this could become an issue later, as long as we're not clear about it now.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. That is to say that there's some tension there, and I think there may be some disagreement about what protect means in that conversation. But I don't want to let it go. I think that this language, as proposed, the requested change, puts that conversation and that tension off to another day. And it's a conversation that we can have when we get to that. But I just want to be transparent and open with this group about my priorities there. I don't share the perspective that drinking water production is incompatible with forest harvest.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that perspective. So thanks. And I agree we can continue to grapple with what all this means with regards to proposals we might get, because certainly what I heard from Kelly is we could expect a proposal from a land trust to say, hey, fund us to purchase this 5 acres of forest land that's adjacent to Seaside's drinking water supply, just as a hypothetical.
That's right. And I only mean to speak up now to signal to Kelly what at least this one member may be looking for in that conversation.
Got it. Appreciate it.
I would just add, moreover, that the fund is not for drinking water per se, of course. We'll be looking for the nexus with the covered species.
Correct.
That's the primary issue. Chad, please.
Just want to add to what Heath is saying and voice my support for what he is saying. and to clarify explicitly that this fund is to benefit the covered species and offset the take from the covered activities. And to make abundantly clear that this is not for drinking water quality, quantity, or anything associated with that. I do support easements that inhibit development, which is maybe a less compatible land use than working forests. But also to Heath's point, I don't believe that working forests are an incompatible land use for drinking water production. So I guess that's all I'm trying to say is that I agree with Heath. There's a couple members that feel the same way. And I want to just make sure that we're focused on the covered species and the covered activities and not get pulled too far off course in some of these other initiatives.
Great, thanks. I'm going to call on myself now just to note briefly that for me, the question on acquisitions will really be a matter of scale, and frequency. So I recognize that tension. I hope it would be mitigated in part if it was relatively infrequent in terms of the effect on the working landscape. I'd also note that a mechanism is of rotation age is out there as a way to potentially get at shaping the character of the forest in desirable ways. Lastly, I just want to note with a topic of acquisitions that will undoubtedly come into the issue of public access as something we wrestle with potentially if there is a change in access as a result of an acquisition. So just a couple of topics to touch on there. Chad, please.
I guess I would also like to add that I care less about who owns the habitat and more about what is being done to enhance the habitat. I just don't see one ownership or another being really having much effect on the covered species, and that habitat enhancement projects are likely going to be prioritized in our grading rubric.
Thanks, Chad. Any other comments on this language? Anything anyone would like to share? Now's the chance to chime in. Okay, well, if there are no objections and hearing substantial support from the committee, I'm going to ask Andy to make this requested change. So again, any objections to making this change? Okay, hearing none. Andy, I hope you will make this change and go on to the next slide, please.
All right, so this is our third comment we have. I do have one more slide that follows this for some discussion that was from the working group of some points of discussion with OARs and just general discussion on the OAR document. Before we get to that, this was from the Wild Salmon Center. Again, here's the existing language, supporting acquisition of an existing water right for conservation to in-stream water right, as described in ORS 537.348 to improve in-stream flow conditions. Bob, did you want to expand on this?
Well, yeah, the new change, just to be clear there, is supporting acquisition from willing seller interests in water. And I think the issue there is, again, to broaden away from acquisition only. For example, there may be leasing arrangements that are helpful in that aren't a straight acquisition. So, or there may be agreements about the timing of flow in that isn't acquiring a water right. I'll look to folks who know a lot more about water rights, which I know there are several on the committee here, including Andrew. But my understanding is the intent was to broaden out the instruments that might be useful in protecting stream flow. Andrew?
Yeah, Bob, thanks. I agree. I would just add, it appears also to allow for forbearance agreements to be eligible. In other words, you don't have to put the water right through the OWRD transfer program, whether temporary or permanent transfer, to be funded. You could reach an agreement with an irrigator that during low flows, they stop diverting the creek, but you actually don't change the character of use of the water right to in-stream through ORS 537.348.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, that's helpful. Other comments, discussion, questions about this suggested change? Jennifer.
Yeah, just a question. I'm wondering whether this one should also say for covered species, for covered HCP species instead of native fish and wildlife. I don't have any problems with the rest of the edits though.
That would make sense for me. I like the parallel structure of keeping the focus on the covered species while also recognizing there'll be broader benefits. But Mark, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I would just add, I think the changes are good clarifications and dial into the reality of the array of options that come into play when we're talking about water rights. So I support it.
Any other comments, suggestions on this one? All right, well, I'm not seeing any. I'm inclined again to ask Andy to make this change unless there are objections. So now's your chance to speak up. Okay, hearing none. I hope, Andy, you can go ahead and incorporate this. And it sounds like the one amendment was there suggested by Jennifer, which was the benefit of covered species rather than watersheds and habitat for the broader language that's there now.
Yes, definitely will do. Thank you. So this is the last slide that we have on the OARs. There was kind of 2 points of discussion that got noted in previous drafts since our last meeting. Wanted to bring that up at this meeting. And then, of course, open up the discussion for anything else in the OARs in its entirety. So the first one was wanted to chat about the urgent grants. So the urgent grants, it was put in there a requirement of at least 25% project match of in-kind or dollar. Remember, there's no match on regular grants. Wanted to open up discussion if we still want to keep this match requirement for urgent grants. Or if there's any opposition.
And where are we now? Is the placeholder language, the existing language has the 25% requirement?
Correct,
and
yes.
Yeah. So should we retain that language? That's the question on the table. Any comments from the committee? Andrew, please.
Yeah, I mean, I do recall our discussion of one of the main reasons we'd want the urgent grants is that there's other money out there and we really want to make sure that that money can be spent. So I'm comfortable with this as part of the language.
Other comments? Heath, please.
Only to comment that if Andy's comfortable with it, I am. I don't have a lot of relativity about the hurdle of a 25% project match in circumstances like this. I haven't been involved in grant making, but Andy has. So if that's workable, it's workable for me.
Yeah, and I would just piggy off. I mean, allowing for in-kind or dollar is a pretty broad match opportunity, and urgent grants are presumably going to be piggybacking off another opportunity, the last leg of funding that's needed. So yeah.
Mark, please.
Yeah, I'm trying to think through the sort of situations where this wouldn't be appropriate and they don't come to mind. I think I agree with the others that most likely if there's a urgent need, it's going to be because some projects already rolling and need some help, or there's another funding opportunity that has a deadline tied to it. So we're trying to be responsive and timely. You know, if there was something the department came up with that needed to happen in a hurry and there wasn't a 25% match, I guess I would ask the question, does that mean we wouldn't do it then? But that's the only circumstances I can see where it might work against us. I'm really just thinking out loud, and I just wonder if there's any reason to have a caveat there of some, you know, preferably provides at least a 25% match or something that gives us the ability to lean into that, but it's not an absolute. I don't have a lot of heartburn about it one way or another, but I'm just sharing my thoughts on that.
Chris, Alan, please.
Yeah, this is just thinking out loud a little bit too. As a web board member, I know that we have at least with one of their grant programs, have backed away from requiring a match, with the idea that it may be limiting some of our minority group entities that might be submitting proposals. And this, I think, was a recommendation that came out of our diversity, equity, and inclusion group. And so I know in at least one of the programs, we have changed the language to say something to the effect of up to a 25% project match. In essence, as Mark was just alluding, making a recommendation, but not necessarily a requirement, just to provide maximum flexibility depending on the entity submitting a proposal.
Andrew?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I'm going to argue against what I said just a minute ago, which is this is certainly one of our objectives, right, for this type of funding, is that somebody's got money they got to spend by a certain deadline. And so an alternative could be we make that a eligibility criteria for this is the type of project that we'll consider for urgent requests, but we don't require it as part of the cost share.
I mean, we could make it may require at least 25%. That gives us the discretion to have that if we want, but some good points on either side. Okay, does anyone want to propose something, specific proposal, either staying with this? Mark Stern, I see your hand up again.
I guess my proposal would be that the language is amended here slightly to say urgent grants preferably provide at least a 25% match, which I think gives us the latitude to lean that way, but not have it be mandatory if we choose not to.
That makes sense to me. I guess I would say too, I could imagine an urgent situation where we just want to give the people the money and it's that important to us to do it urgently that we just as soon fund it, despite that lack of a match. So Chris and then Mark.
I support that suggested change by Mark. I think it gives us the appropriate discretion to consider projects that that may not have 25% match. So I support that.
Mark Grenberma?
Yeah, I was going to echo what Chris Allen said. He described it very well. As an OAR, it is something too that a waiver could be developed for. So in example or certain specific grants, you could waive the 25% match requirement. We do that on occasion down to $1, depending on the grant type. It really depends on why or what you want the match to signify. Are you signifying ownership? Are you trying to demonstrate how much money is being brought in to leverage the funds that this committee is going to be awarding? So part of it is going to be dictated, is what do we really want to accomplish with the match? Also, just thinking out loud, maybe it could be worded such that the match level is determined by the committee at the time that the grant cycle is announced.
Okay, that would be more of a, the committee may require a project match. So Mark, you're suggesting there isn't a percentage figure associated with it?
I think it's always good to have a target. In there, I wouldn't say we don't need a percentage in there, but I think that giving the committee the leeway to determine the match at the time of the cycle, especially if you're looking at being responsive to urgent situations, as well as recognizing that different project types don't always have the ability to leverage matching funds like some other types do. So it's always, for an example, with technical assistance, it's harder to get funding from other sources for things like technical assistance and stakeholder engagement and those types of activities and monitoring. It's a lot easier to get match for restoration. The caveat in that, of course, is how quick the project has been put together. And I think in an urgent situation, it's going to be a lot harder on the applicant to cobble together other matching sources as easily as it would be as if it was a planned out project. So.
Great. Thanks, Mark. I'll just note for everybody, we've got about 10 more minutes for the OAR discussion. Sarah and then Fran. I see hands up. Sarah, please.
Just a quick note that when I think we're talking about match in the context of urgent grants, which would happen outside of the normal cycle, and so wouldn't be prompted by a solicitation. So there wouldn't be that opportunity for the committee to be setting the match requirement for those urgent grants. So just a clarification on what Mark is saying, that may not work unless you all want to come up with some additional process by which annually you set your match requirement for urgent grants, but I don't know that that makes sense.
Thanks, Sarah. That's an important clarification. Fran.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I feel like maybe we're getting a little bit bogged down. I just want to, we do have the non-urgent, the standard way that doesn't require any kind of a match. So I'm really comfortable requiring a match, but I am okay with changing the language to say may require or preferably require, just so that I like the idea of being more inclusive. So I think we can button this up.
Thank you, Fran. I agree too. I think why don't we go with preferably require to note the interest there, but that leaves the wiggle room that it's not an absolute essential in rule. So I guess I would also say that, so let's move on and leave it at preferable, but also note that there's time for more comment or discussion on this, and the OAR group could certainly meet again and consider this further. Let's go to the next topic. What's the retroactive grantee reimbursement topic? Andy, could you touch on that briefly, please?
Yes. So this was noted as possible clarification. So we talked in some of the working groups, but also in past committee meetings about being able to support applicants from the get-go, right? Make this an easy process. And part of that was giving the ability to applicants to retroactively receive funding for direct project expenses. So not application building, not building the grant or that kind of stuff or planning for that. But for example, they could submit a request to reimburse among pending award to reimburse permit costs. So say, for example, a grantee is applying to do a culvert removal or an in-stream project. They've had to go through a whole slew for the summer before to get the permits approved. They talked to the Army Corps and everyone else. They could put in their project application the costs that it took to achieve those permits that are directly related to the project they're applying for. As it stands right now, there is language that would allow for that in here for them to recoup those direct costs, but it would be at the discretion of the MAC at the time of consideration. So that's, hopefully that paints the picture. I can clarify a bit more if anyone would like, but I just want to make sure we wanted to keep that intention in the OARs. It is there as it stands.
Great. I see Heath has his hand up, and I guess I would also say to other committee members, is this a common practice or best practice for those who are in the granting world already? Be helpful to know how common this sort of thing is. Heath, please.
Yeah, I had a similar question. I hadn't caught that in the rules before, Andrew, and that seems a little weird to me. Certainly we don't want people spending money they don't have on a gamble that they might get that money back from us. That seems like bad policy. And to the degree that they do have the money, that is to say, they were spending the money not in anticipation of getting it back from us, it seems that by reimbursing those costs, we would be subsidizing other programs or priorities of that organization. That is to say, they would then shift that money to other expenditures. That I would be curious if that's how other programs work. That strikes me as opening us up to inadvertently funding things we had not anticipated we were funding through substitution of dollars that they had already committed.
Mark Grenbremer and then Mark Stern, please.
Yeah, thanks. In the reality is most groups don't have the funding to undertake extensive permitting processes. That combined with the fact that, you know, the uncertainty of whether they'll get the grant or not, a lot of times they will hold off on doing those permitting costs, at least in regards to a restoration grant. In OWEB, we do have the technical assistance grants that do allow for permitting activities to be done under that grant. So they can do that a lot more safely, knowing that their costs will be reimbursed. But it's a big risk if somebody's just gonna undertake the permitting in the hopes that they'll get funded and get those costs. In response to Heath's question, a lot of times in our applications, we'll get permitting costs and a restoration grant is match. And so it's, you see those permitting costs because they are eligible match within the budget. And I'm guessing that if an applicant wanted reimbursement on permitting costs they had already done, you would see that evidenced in the budget they submitted as part of the application. Currently, the only permit costs that that OWEB will reimburse for without having approved grant is if they get the land use form signed that we require. But even that now is getting a lot more costly in some of the areas with some of the FEMA floodplain costs going. And so I would be surprised unless there was a simple permitting process either tied to a Department of Forestry notification or an ARBO permit that was maybe tied to a large wood placement. Most permits are going to be costly, and folks would probably want to make sure they had the project funded before they would undertake those activities. So thanks.
Mark Stern.
Yeah, I don't want to go too far down into the weeds to it, but sort of Heath, in response to your comment, where I saw it helpful sometimes is if a grant is approved, by the appropriate board or commission, sometimes it can take, 4 weeks to maybe 10 weeks to get the grant approved. So it's been helpful once it's approved to have items that were in the budget. It gives a green light to the applicant to go ahead and start spending some of that money after it's approved, but before it's actually signed. And sometimes that's helpful. And otherwise, in some ways, I think it's ODF&W's call on how they want to manage retroactive reimbursements.
Heath?
I just, those two are both good examples of things I would support as well. That is to say, qualifying, expenditures prior to approval, qualifying as match. That makes good policy sense to me. They're bringing that asset to the table, that's skin in the game. And then, Mark, the one you just described there, post-approval, but prior to the check, to the degree that it's in the budget and that we've approved that budget, then yeah, I'd be fine, with that as well. I think that those are both different, though, than cash reimbursement for pre-approval permitting expenses. That to me strikes me as a very different category, and that would be them kind of betting on the come on our benevolence. And that strikes me as, again, prone to substitution for other program priorities for that organization.
Thank you for that, Heath. Chad, please, I'll just note we're running short of time for our OAR discussion. Chad.
Yep. Thanks. And I'll keep it really brief here, Bob. I think that we can just continue to keep retroactive grantee reimbursements for project specific expenses incurred post approval and prior disbursement of funds. And then that still allows us to use expenses prior to approval as match. And it means that we're only going to reimburse expenses incurred after approval, but prior to funding disbursement. I think that kind of fixes a few of these things.
Any discussion of that? I'll take that as a proposed amendment. Chad, any discussion of that proposal? Concerns about that from the group? Okay, well, I'll just say for myself, that makes good sense to me. But given that we are short of time, we'll also look for if ODF&W wants to bring this back to us with some more details in June or in the cycle here before the June submission. We can continue that conversation. So we're quite short of time to spend more things. I'll just open it up nonetheless. Does anyone have anything they want to flag in the OARs that feels like a burning concern? That Mark, I think I see your hand up there. Stern.
Yeah, one other comment that I shared with Andy, and I don't know if you meant to include it or not, but it was in the OARs under evaluation criteria. There's a list of them under number 3, and they're all pretty straightforward. They are
Thanks for bringing this up, Mark. Yeah, I had hoped that we'd bring it up at this point, actually.
So there's a list of about 6 things that are supposed to be included in the application, and most of them are pretty straightforward. My interest was in including another one, which I put in the chat there, which is simply a description of other conservation or natural resource benefits, if any, that may be supported by the proposed project. And again, it just goes to my interest in being able to highlight what other additional benefits may be achieved through work that's being done designed to provide conservation to the covered species. And I can think of anything from, redesigning a road system on private forest land where you're moving roads off the bottom land, but maybe it's creating some efficiencies and operations by having roads replaced. By replaced, I mean repositioned. And even when we're talking about source water, if you're putting in a culvert with the idea of passage and it reduces sediment inputs and it's improving water quality for fish and a source supply for a municipality, I just think we ought to have the applicant provide that information. Again, I don't see it as a criteria for funding, but I think it's really important to call those things out. And looking in the work that's been done so far on the evaluation criteria document, there seems to be reference to that kind of thing. So again, I think the OARs are an opportunity to help define the spirit of what we're trying to achieve. And I think as we look at how do we fund the work for these covered species going forward, the more we can identify additional benefits, the better placed we'll be. So that was my reasoning for asking that be considered there.
Amen.
And just to clarify, it's in the 0080 sub 3. Is that correct?
I think so, yes.
I believe so.
As a something that's being provided by the project application is that
Correct.
information on the broader benefits, right? So this is not a formal criteria, but this is information the committee will have as part of the application process. Pardon me. I think someone chimed in support. There any concerns with that? Can you repeat that language again, Mark, that you'd like to have added there?
It's in the chat. It is a description of other conservation or natural resource benefits, if any, that may be supported from the proposed project.
Any concerns about that addition? Okay, well, hearing none, Andrew, I'll ask you to include that as well. Given that timeliness is so important here, and it's a little less so on the scope of work and the grant evaluation criteria, which we have time to return to. If there are other comments, I think it's best that we run over now and spend a little time on them. So if there are any comments on the OARs now that have not been brought up, now would be the time to raise them. Okay, well, seeing none, we can happily leave this agenda item behind. Thanks, everybody, for your constructive conversation on this. We're just a little bit behind. Let's go on then to the expenditure framework and grant evaluation criteria, which are two other substantial documents that have been getting quite a bit of work. And Andy, I'll turn to you on that.
All right, great. And one last thing just to add for the working group, I'll reach out to you shortly to schedule our next follow-up meeting for the OAR working group. We will go to the next slide here. So we wanted to start, introducing the discussion around the expenditure framework and the grant evaluation criteria. You've all received the most updated drafts of what the working groups have been working on for the past few weeks and months since they were tasked earlier this year. Hopefully today's is just kind of a discussion, your first look at it in its entirety, questions, concerns, points of consideration for the working groups moving forward. That's what I'm really hoping to get out. So the first one is going to be the expenditure framework. This is going to be more in its final draft. Hopefully we can adopt that by the committee, at a later point this summer, maybe next meeting or the one thereafter. But yeah, you've seen this slide before, so I'll ping back to you, Bob, but I was just going to open it up for discussion at this point for the expenditure framework. If there is any comments, you should have all received the final draft of it.
Thank you. Are there comments on the PFA expenditure framework? I see you've got final draft there. I just am checking in on where this is process-wise. So, I mean, you're not asking for a formal vote now. I think this is a discussion item. Is this something you want us to adopt formally at a future meeting? Is it the next meeting? Yeah, just remind me. Yeah,
this is very similar to like the operating procedures. So we can adopt it at the next one if we'd like. And we can kind of chat about that maybe in our follow-up chair meeting. But yeah, if we don't have any discussion points now, we can table it and move forward as we see appropriate.
And can you remind us, I see Mark has a comment, can you remind us who some of the key subgroup folks have been who've been working on this?
Yes, this was Fran and Kristen. They assisted with working on this one.
Great, thank you both. Mark Stern.
Yeah, just a clarification in terms of timing. I started to your point, so we're sort of seeing this here. If we wanted to provide any comment or input, when would you like to receive it by?
Thank you, I appreciate that. Before the next meeting, so before I send out review package would be great. We don't have a meeting set up with the working group, so feel free to send it to me and I can work with both Kristen and Fran to incorporate and review any edits. But for presumably the next 3 weeks would be great. Give us at least a few days before we send out the review packet for our June 14th meeting, I believe it is.
Okay, that sounds good. Sounds like you don't anticipate at least the subcommittee making a lot of additional changes to it.
The working group, no, they're wrapped up at this point. Unless Fran wanted to add anything, but I think we discussed last time, it's gotten to a point that we're all comfortable with, that would represent the committee's mindset.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, Fran, for your work on this. So just to reiterate, folks, if you haven't got a chance to give this a look over and you'd like to, it's in the next 3 weeks is the deadline to get some comments back to Andy. Andy, then maybe you could present any final changes or things in the next meeting and we can put this on the June agenda for approval. I'd just like to note, like the operating procedures, this is something we could return to and change too. So it doesn't have the same kind of gravity as the OARs. All right,
Correct.
thank you. The next item.
All right, so this is the grant evaluation criteria. This is the first time I think you guys have seen this in its entirety. This working group was made up of Andrew Perkey and myself originally, and then we thought we needed some extra minds in there. So we invited Heath and Kristen to the working group, and Mark was on there too, Graham Bremmer. So this is more than just that what you see on the page there, that evaluation criteria. We actually took a big step back and we created the scope of work document, the application questions that you've all received. We thought we needed to grade the application questions first, the scope of work, because we wanted to, before we could grade them, we needed to know what we were asking and going to grade on. So that's kind of what we set up for you guys. I'm going to pass it over to Andrew if you wanted to add anything to this before we open it up for discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I would say the two big issues are that connecting what we want to grade, making sure the questions we ask the applicants are right so that they can provide us the information that we need to be able to evaluate the projects individually and then against each other. The second, and you'll see it in the draft, is the relative importance in terms of points of the different criteria, because I think we made good progress on what we want to review these projects against, but how we score or emphasize the different criteria with the points that are ascribed is going to really influence which projects rise to the top. So those would just be the two key things I would emphasize about what we need to do next, particularly the second point.
Andy?
And I just wanted to add, of course, open up for discussion at this point from your first take, but this will be a document. As Bob said, we're not in a rush to get this done this month, next month. We'll be working on over summer. We do have it in the upcoming schedule that we will have more lengthy discussion, brainstorming and conversation around this. But we're really interested in your first look right now. But this is by far not your final look. I don't believe we're formally wrap this up until August, right? We need this wrapped up before we launch the grant, of course, in September, but I want to paint that. Thank you.
Heath?
I just wanted to highlight for the group that, at least, I was on one of these meetings, and I don't think it would be fair to say that this is like well baked at this point. It was pretty quick, and my review was pretty quick, and I think everybody's open to input. Frankly, I have some thoughts and comments that I would add at this stage as well, but I didn't want to, sometimes you come into these and you're like, hey, that committee, did some really heavy lifting and cast all of this in cement, and that's not the case here.
Thank you.
Yeah, concur with Heath.
Thanks. And I just will note that this is a real important one too, because this is what we're going to be looking at very specifically to approve and deny, as well as the weighting question that you've noted already. That is how much, what's getting points and why. So we want to be
Bob,
quite helpful. Yeah.
That is a question, I guess. Is it your anticipation, for context around this conversation, that ODF and W will take the first shot at scoring using these evaluation criteria? Is this who is going to be using this document?
So it's a great question that we need to talk about, I think, and I know Andy's been thinking about how to balance the relative engagement of the committee members with the workload that might be developed, as well as including ODF and W staff. So I think that's something we need to talk about further. That's my impression, at least. Andy, do you have some more thoughts there? Or Sarah, welcome any thoughts on the committee about really this gets into that process question, how we're going to use this document. Yeah,
Great question. Definitely, I'm hoping that next month or midsummer, we're going to actually get into kind of a thought exercise to really think about that. Initially, what we are drafting up for review, without me going into too much too much into the weeds, is that there will be essentially 3 layers of review. The first one is just a checkbox. It'll come to Salem. We'll check that everything's good to go. They got the application in, they met the minimum requirements. That's what we're looking for. It will then go through a process called the technical review teams, which I've consulted with OWEB, a few other grantors, of course, internally and what they do. And that's how I kind of come up with this draft idea, very much a draft. But it would then, so we would send it out to technical review teams. The idea initially is that the state would be divided amongst different regions. So I'm going to arbitrarily say 10. There's 10 technical review teams, okay? Or let's say 12, because there's 12 MAC members. That might be easier. We'll say there's 12 technical review teams across the state, divided by however ecoregions, watersheds, however we decide. In each of those regions, they will use this document to review and score. They are the ones who will be looking at it. So who will make up that technical review team in each region? So my idea initially was that it would have 1 committee member in that's not in their home region, of course. It would have 1 staff from ODFW, presumably a PFA funded position, right? A stream bio, someone who's on the ground, boots on the ground, knows what's happening. We would make most likely a request to ODF, hopefully, that we get a forester involved. And then we would have a 4th seat that would be an NGO, non-governmental official. That is a rotating chair or a rotating seat. So that allows for a watershed council, a land trust, or whomever, another nonprofit conservation district to come in. Maybe that chair is given up every year or 2 or whatever we decide, and they're able to give their local opinion. So each of those 4 reviewers will submit their own scores, basically. They will be a pod, so they'll be able to somewhat talk with each other, but they'll get their scores. They'll then send everything up back to Salem, at which point it becomes a little fuzzy on what we're going to do at that point. But it'll get back to Salem. I will compile it. We'll then move into the MAC review, where the MAC will see the projects. There will be, on top of the scoring, whatever the technical review team says they scored X out of X points, there will be a checkbox. Recommend for funding, don't recommend for funding. There will be an explanation with that. So we'll come to the committee will review it. We're assuming we're going to have a lot of applications. So it's going to be very different than what you might see other ODFW committees review, where they go through each and every application because they only have 10. If you have 100+ applications, that could be a lengthy time to go through each one. So you have to come up with some kind of ranking. Once the committee decides on what ones to move forward, it will then go to commission. So that's kind of the process in a nutshell. There's a lot to be figured out still, especially when it gets to the committee and how we go through the reviews and disagreements. But hopefully that answers your question to some extent, Heath.
Yeah, Heath, back to you. And I'll just note we need to keep moving on. We've got about 15 minutes left for the meeting. Heath, please.
Well, I guess then I would solicit more conversations about that topic. I've got some thoughts on that. One, the homework piece, Andy, if I may. I never know which. I need to decide who is Andy and who is Andrew. But I would be interested. I know that there are public records exemptions for deliberative materials, and I think that once the agency scores a project and it becomes a public record, that's going to create a great deal of inertia, and it's going to become very difficult for the advisory committee to have meaningful input that deviates from that scoring. And I would be interested in having an opportunity for this committee to weigh in and have input on that prior to memorializing the conclusions of the agency, if possible. I just think that it will appear terribly politic if the agency staffers, for whatever reason, land in one place, but the mitigation advisory committee, given kind of weighing the different priorities and the way in which we think it may help sell this program land in a different place. And I think that would be an unfortunate outcome. And so to the degree there are ways to accommodate input from this committee without publishing, the agency's draft, as I would style it, scoring and prioritization, I think that would be good.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
definitely
thanks.
something.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think, this criteria, the process that we're discussing right now, to sort through it, really bear a lot more thought in the months ahead here. So I'm glad that we kicked this off today. And Andy, maybe at some point we can even get a brief presentation of a proposed route, or we may even want to have some subgroup conversation
Is that-
to get some reaction. Yeah.
Is that structure that Andy just described going to appear in a document somewhere?
I think
Not
we'll
right
need to
now,
memorialize it. Yeah.
but
Pardon me. Go ahead, Andy.
yeah, eventually we will need to make it clear for applicants. As it stands in the rules, though, we just say we'll go through a review process. But we will need to make that clear so applicants know what to expect.
Well, yeah, and on those technical review teams, I think we need to decide as a group who's on those, or at
Yeah, and
least
I was
that
gonna-
needs to be in some documentation.
I was going to propose, Bob, a working group maybe at the next meeting we convene one who helps review and create this process to bring to the committee.
Yeah, maybe we can start the discussion a little further with a straw man or some key elements of the process that you reviewed today next time, and we can then get a subgroup. Mark Stern, comment?
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot to sort through there, and I think having a subgroup work on it is a good idea. I'd be glad to be part of that.
Great. Okay, any other comments on the expenditure framework or the grant evaluation criteria? Again, these are evolving documents that are going to be really important, particularly the evaluation criteria. And then we've obviously raised this other issue of who will be using those criteria and what's the process for actually doing the evaluation. Okay, well, there's time yet. These will be in the future meeting, which is really the next topic, which is what's coming up ahead here. We have on the current agenda the next in-person meeting. Andy, would you like to address that? And there you go, outlook ahead.
Yeah, so I'll real quick go towards this in person and I'll move on to the schedule, which will be our last slide. So we are wanting to have an in-person meeting. We're looking at, early next year in 2024 doing that. Just because we have a lot of priorities coming up this year, we have a lot of stuff to figure out. I want to keep that momentum going with this committee. We're doing an extraordinary job pushing a grant program within a year to launch, which is a huge feat for any government entity, let alone a public-private one. So, originally the idea was later this year to get an in-person meeting going, but that's going to put us right in the middle of our grant solicitation opening, wrapping up OERs, and then possibly winter holidays. Hoping we can do something at the World Forestry Center early next year with the objectives of long-term strategic planning and goal setting, discussion around an in-depth discussion around outreach and engagement. And then, possibly some informational presentations, of which we can have sooner, which we're talking with the chairs about now, having that sooner. But that could come from the services, talking about priorities, conservation priorities in relation to the Habitat Conservation Plan covered species. And this would be it would be a 2-day event, but essentially you'd meet right after lunch on the first day to the afternoon, overnight. We would then meet in the morning and have a brown bag lunch and break. So it'd be really kind of 8 hours a meeting, 8 to 10 hours, but spanned across 2 days in Portland. Yeah, open up for discussion at that point.
Chad?
Thanks, Andy. And I understand the need to focus on the work ahead and not the logistics of planning this meeting to make it happen earlier in the year. But I do think that item number 3 here is going to be really key to informing our conversation we just had around this grant evaluation criteria and who is using them. So if there's a way to move that item up, I think we really need to focus on that. If folks like Heath and I that maybe don't understand some of these landscape level conservation initiatives or priorities by the services, we need to hear from them if we're going to be expected to review these grant applications and to be able to meaningfully provide feedback to the evaluation criteria. So I guess that would be my request, that we focus on number 3 here if we're going to move anything up before Q1, Q2 of next year.
So maybe like a July informational meeting from the services.
I think that'd be helpful if they could do it. I think it's good for us to get that conversation started for certain. And it may be even the sort of thing we do want a subgroup to bore in a little bit more, just to gather materials that can be brought forward in summary. And I'm sure ODM&W staff might have some opinions about priorities as well that would be helpful for us to hear.
Yeah, Andy, I think your next slide has informationals for August, was it? Or the timeline slide does.
Yes, here we go. No, I don't have it on there.
Yeah, it is.
Is it?
Under August 12th.
Conservation priority presentations on August 12th.
Oh, yes, it is there. Perfect. So yeah, I guess in August we can have it there. You know, with the, I don't know if July would be
Worse. It's worse.
bad.
It may be
Worse.
the most vacationed month of the year, maybe other than the last week of December.
The only reason I would say in July is because we're launching in September. So if we want this to be a guiding discussion around our priorities, if we have it in July, that gives us a month to make some changes, or, you know, or it's not in that sense, and it's, you know, it's guiding in the sense of when we review stuff. We're now with that understanding.
And is there a way to bring that up to, say, June? I mean, I
Well,
don't know if there's any need to continue to wait to hear from others on these conservation priorities, or if there can be a special, you know, we call a special meeting, or if we can get some email communication, any way that we can hear from them to inform the next set of conversations around this grant criteria evaluation form, and then how we're going to use those forms.
Heath and then Mark.
Yeah. I mean, Chad, I'm in total agreement that I could use that same education. The way the criteria are drafted now is pretty helpful in this context, in that it says like scoring the degree to which it aligns with the conservation priorities, right? And we can use that and make that conclusion later. It's also the case that those criteria, we won't conclude with those until well after approval of the OAR. So Andy, I'm not in a big rush to get this done. And by the way, by the time we're to July, like there's not going to be any changes made to the OARs anyway. We'd have to start over. Like everything's pre-baked by that time prior to commission approval. And so I don't see a lot of flexibility to changing the OARs in July.
Mark and then Kate.
I guess I like Chad's comment of having some of the conservation priorities moved up to June if the services are able to do it and the department. And I think partly hearing what those priorities are help you think as you go through the criteria process. It gives you something more real to think about, to sort of translate back and forth and, you know, cross-reference what are the criteria are as you're sort of integrating and hearing what some of the priorities may be. And sort of with that in mind, sort of separate, but maybe part of it is a friendly amendment. Although I'm not in favor of long meetings, I think a 2-hour time slot might provide just a little bit more time for some discussion among the advisory committee. I'd really encourage the ex officio members to chime in as well, and that, you know, having another 30 minutes might give us a little more ability to dialogue, brainstorm, and have conversations. And I think it's really important because we're all going through this together. It's going really quickly, and there is some good work done in the subcommittees, but that's my thought on how we might be able to move up some of these things and also have some more dialogue amongst all of us.
Agreed. Maybe Andy, if you could canvass folks after this meeting to see if that 2 hours is possible, or who has problems with extending to 2. Kate Wells, please.
Hi, I was thinking about this a little bit in terms of getting you some information about conservation priorities, and that got me to thinking that it would be really helpful to have the goals and objectives that are outlined in the HCP before us for that discussion, because the conservation strategy stems from achieving those goals and objectives, and the projects that are considered under this program should be meeting the conservation strategy elements in terms of offsetting the covered activities. So I can try to determine where that process is, because I think that would be really helpful. I mean, of course, we have general goals and strategies, you know, improving fish passage and floodplain connection and things like that. But because the projects that will be reviewed under this program should specifically be meeting the goal of offsetting very specific covered activities, seeing how that is coming together with the HCP, I think would be really helpful in that discussion to help focus us a little bit. But that was just a thought that, you know, I'm trying to weave all this together in my head. So when we do provide you with information, it's as useful as it can possibly be.
Thank you, Kate. I'll just note we've got about 3 minutes left. I'm going to suggest we drop the closing comments. We can keep that very brief if we need to. Please, Chad and then Jennifer, and if you can keep it brief, please.
Yeah, it'll be very brief here, Bob. I think we would be happy to provide that, and we can pull it straight out of the author's report on what the covered species are intended to be and what the covered activities are intended to be. And then I'll just give the rest of the time to Jennifer since she's working on that HCP.
Yeah, I was gonna say I can one up that in that I can give you share with the group at least the draft of what we have currently for our covered species list, which is just more expansive than what is in the PFA report, as well as the BGO, the biological goals and objectives that we currently have in front of us. Everything HCP is of course officially draft, but those are fairly well along that I believe I could share those.
Chad?
Jennifer, thanks for that. A little interested to hear more about the additional species that were included in the HCP and how that came to be. So maybe we can discuss that at another time.
Sure, we can chat offline. There are no additional species. It's just fleshing out the species list for salmon and trout.
Okay. Thanks for that clarification.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you all for your work today. We've got a little bit of time. I'll just say for myself briefly, I would like everyone to know that Chad and I have regular meetings with Andy and Sarah, as well as some email chains that you don't see much of, but those are happening regularly in between our main meetings here. And I have been blind copying all of you on some information that has come to me, as well as encouraging public input. So I just want to say for myself, I'm happy to have separate conversation with any of you if it'd be helpful to talk separately to me. And I encourage group members to talk to one another, obviously, as well. So any other comments anybody would like to make in our final minute here? Observations?
Just another thank you to Andy. He's working very hard at all of this. So thank you to Andy and Sarah and everyone at ODFW.
Other comments? Okay, thanks everybody. Well, please check your calendars for 2 hours for the next meeting if you can. Otherwise, thank you all for your time today, and onward we go.
Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone. Great meeting.